July 1882. The streets of Seoul buzz with whispers of unrest. Deep within the palace walls, soldiers rise up in rebellion. Government officials are attacked. The kingdom teeters on the edge of chaos. This is the Imo Incident, a violent military mutiny that rocked the Joseon Dynasty, exposing a fierce battle between tradition, reform, and foreign influence. But to understand how it came to this, we have to step back into a kingdom fighting for its very survival. By the late 19th century, Korea's Joseon Dynasty was struggling to survive. Inside its borders, a rigid social system and factional infighting tore at its core. Beyond them, Japan, China, and Russia circled like predators, each one hungry for influence. In the palace, a young king, Gojong, barely in his 20s, dreamed of modernizing his kingdom. He was young, ambitious, and determined to drag his country into the modern age. Inspired by Japan's Meiji Restoration and the self-strengthening movement in China, he imagined a stronger army, a modern state, and a future that could resist imperialism's tide. But change always comes at a cost. Gojong appointed foreign reformers to overhaul the military. The new army recruits, many from humble backgrounds, were trained by foreign advisors, handed gleaming new rifles, and marched proudly through Seoul's streets in crisp new uniforms. Meanwhile, the old army, veteran officers and long-serving soldiers, were left with outdated weapons and shrinking stipends. The old army watched it all with growing resentment. They had bled for this kingdom. They had lived by its codes. And now they were cast aside. It wasn't just about pay. It was about pride, too. Centuries of honor and status were suddenly slipping through their fingers. These men had devoted their lives to the kingdom, only to feel cast aside in favor of untested recruits with shiny new guns. But the deeper trigger was far more immediate and raw: unpaid wages. For months, many soldiers had not been paid in rice, the currency of the day. And worse, when rations came, they found sand and foul-smelling millet mixed into their rice supplies. In June, King Gojong ordered a month's allowance of rice to be given, tasking Min Gyum-ho, the queen's nephew, to oversee it. Instead, Min's steward sold the good rice and replaced it with its inedible mixture, deepening the soldiers' fury. The air in Seoul grew heavy with suspicion. Court officials exchanged nervous glances, knowing that a single spark could set the capital ablaze. They knew the spark was coming, and it was closer than anyone dared imagine. Inside the barracks, whispers spread like wildfire. Reformers weren't saviors, they were traitors, puppets of foreign powers dismantling the very soul of the nation. And then the slow burn met dry tinder. Summer 1882, a sweltering June night. The old army rose. They poured from the barracks, torches in hand, their shouts echoing off the palace walls. Government officials were hunted down. Palace gates battered open. The capital held its breath, and then terror swallowed it whole. Their rage was raw and violent, not just a cry against reform, but a desperate fight for what they believed was Korea's survival. The rioters cut down officials, set fire to the homes of high ministers, and stormed the Cheongdeokgun Palace itself. Then came the legation. They turned their fury towards the Japanese mission. Lieutenant Horimoto Raizo, the Japanese military advisor brought in to modernize the army, was dragged into the street and killed by the mob. A force of some 3,000 rioters, armed with weapons looted from armories, laid siege to the Japanese legation. Inside, Minister Hanabusa Yoshitada and his staff barricaded themselves in, desperately fighting for survival. With no choice, they torched the building, destroying vital documents, and slipped away through a rear gate under the cover of smoke and flames. The fleeing Japanese raced to the harbor, pursued by Korean soldiers. Several were killed or seriously wounded before being rescued days later by the British ship HMS Flying Fish. Seoul was a battlefield, smoke rising over rooftops, gunfire shattering the night. The air stank of ash and fear. Palace guards and rebels clashed in brutal close combat, each fighting for a vision of Korea's future. Shops were stripped bare, families fled into the darkness, and the streets were littered with the wounded. Their demands were clear: remove the reformers and restore the old order. For King Gojong, this was no mere mutiny. It was a crucible, the first real test of his dream, and whether it could survive the storm. Inside the palace, King Gojong was trapped. Rebellious soldiers outside, reformist officials inside, each side shouting for his loyalty, each demanding the king's future on their terms. The city was burning, the army was fractured, the court near collapse. With no loyal force strong enough to end the chaos and retake control, Gojong faced a choice that would shape Korea's fate for decades. He called for help. In Joseon politics, a king's in-laws often meant power and trouble. When Gojong first married Queen Min, his father and regent thought he'd chosen well. She was an orphan from the Yohong clan, a family without major political clout, no powerful uncles, no dangerous brothers, no threat. But Queen Min was far from powerless. Once on the throne beside her husband, she began appointing her relatives to key positions, weaving a web of influence through the palace. She allied with her father-in-law's rivals, quietly building a faction strong enough to push the regent out of power by 1873. Her faction looked to Qing China as Korea's strongest protector against Japan and the West. So when the mutiny broke out, it was her allies in Beijing that the king and queen turned to for help. The choice would save the throne, but tighten the chains of Chinese control. Within days, Chinese troops marched into Seoul, their banners flying above smoke-filled streets. They crushed the mutiny and restored order, at least on the surface. But the price was steep. Foreign soldiers now patrolled the capital, a daily reminder of how fragile Korea's sovereignty had become. China quickly reasserted control, stationing troops under Wu Changqing, who took charge of retraining the Korean army along Chinese lines. This supplied Korea with rifles, cannons, and ammunition, reshaping the military into a force modeled after Qing standards. Foreign advisors stepped in, reorganizing Korea's customs service, ensuring Beijing's hand reached deep into the nation's economy. King Gojong's sovereignty was diminished. He could no longer appoint diplomats without Chinese approval. Some saw the Chinese as saviors, others as occupiers. As the dust settled, resentment toward foreign influence, and toward the king who had invited them in, began to simmer. What had begun as a soldier's revolt was now something larger, a symbol of a kingdom stuck in the jaws of both internal division and external domination. Contemporary records paint a grim picture. Officials vanished without a trace. Night after night, soldiers dragged suspects from their homes. The streets were heavy with fear. Brutal reprisals against anyone suspected of sympathy for the rebels. The Imo Incident had exposed the fragile balance of Joseon's court, where tradition clashed violently with modernity. And loyalty was often less about conviction and more about survival. For modern citizens, the uprising was terrifying. For the ruling elite, it was a crisis that demanded swift and sometimes ruthless action. Though the mutiny was over, its scars remained. Reforms slowed as caution replaced ambition. Factional rivalries deepened, with each side more distrustful than before. And Korea's reliance on foreign powers only tightened. The Imo Incident was more than a rebellion. It was a warning, a flicker of the storms to come. Decades of unrest, foreign intervention, and eventually Japanese annexation loomed ahead. Japan, too, took note. The crisis exposed their military weakness abroad. They accelerated their military expansion, determined never again to let Chinese troops decide Korea's fate. The fire lit in 1882 would smolder and flare for the next century. Today, the Imo Incident is little remembered outside of academic circles. It is often overshadowed by later rebellions and wars. But this forgotten blaze reveals much about Korea's struggle. Caught between preserving heritage and embracing change during one of the most dangerous eras in history. It reminds us that history isn't just about dates and battles, but about the human stories of fear, hope, and survival. The echoes of the Imo Incident still whisper through Korea's complex past and present. This was never just about soldiers and rifles. It was about identity, sovereignty, survival. And it asks us all, how far will you go to hold on to who you are? And what will you sacrifice to become something new? Thank you for exploring this hidden chapter of Korean history with us. If you found this journey compelling, please like, subscribe, and tell us which stories you'd like uncovered next.